Continuing our reading in The World and Thorinn by Damon Knight, Chapter 14, Section 1, How Thorinn was offered dominion over the world at a price, and learned his true name. He came up out of the darkness with a gasp and a shudder. Then he saw that he was still in the same room. It was a moment longer before he realized that the net on the wall was empty. All his possessions, including the box and the magic jug, were gone. When thirst began to fret him, he took off his clothes and went into the washing box. But as he had more than half expected, nothing happened when he put his feet on the floor. He did not bother to dress again. Without the box to talk to or anything to occupy his hands, he had nothing to do but to wander through the empty rooms around and around. Presently he was hungry as well as thirsty. He thought with longing of the fruit he had eaten in the cavern of the flower people, and again in the demon's cavern, of the crisp, dry taste of cheese, of dried meat, tough and full of flavor. That passed, and the thirst remained. When he was younger, he had had a mouse kept in a cage he had carved out of an old oak gall. He had fed it grain and oatmeal, and a bit of cheese now and then. He remembered how the mouse had sat up and nibbled the cheese, turning it around and around with its dainty paws. He slept and woke again. Nothing in the rooms had changed. His thirst was a torment. His throat and tongue were dry, his lips cracking. His very eyeballs were dry. Each time he passed the crystals in the wall, he felt the engine watching, silent, waiting for him to speak first. He vowed to himself that he would not, if he died for it. When he slept again, he dreamed that he was drinking long, delicious draughts from the spring above Hovenskar, and that the sky was blue and the grass yellow. Then the water turned to dry leaves in his mouth, and he awoke. He was very feeble, and it was too much effort even to pull his weightless body from one pole to another. Toward the end of that day, he began to see figures moving in the room. He saw Goriat and Untha and a tree demon, but they were transparent. He awoke and knew that something had changed. Over his face, a crystal shell drew away. His thirst was gone. He licked his lips, and they were moist. Now the engine with the spidery arms was drifting toward him. The arms reached out, plucked him up gently from the box he was in. He had an impulse to free himself, but forbore. They were rising through the circular hole in the ceiling. Now they were in the sleeping room. The engine put him with his back against the pole, just as it had done before. The coils came around him. The engine withdrew and disappeared into the room below. "Are you ready to answer questions now?" asked the voice. "No," he said. "Bring back my things." "Your things will be brought." Thorinn released himself from the coils, tried the water tube. Although he felt no thirst, he drank, swallowed a little, spat the rest out. Next he tried the food tube, and this time, in place of the sticky mass that had come before, a bolus of something firmer came into his mouth. It was like a soft cheese. He did not like the texture, but the taste was not bad. He chewed and swallowed it, then took another. The engine reappeared with his bundles clutched in its arms. It floated to the net on the wall and dexterously tucked all the bundles inside. All the things he had had before were there, but not his sword or bow. "Bring my weapons, too," he said. The voice did not reply. Thorinn made his way to the washing box and cleaned himself. When he came out feeling stronger, the engine was rising through the hole with his sword, the bow, and half a dozen arrows in its arms. He thrust the weapons into the net, turned, and dropped out of sight again. The bow was cracked, the arrows had lost all their pitch, but the sword and sheath were intact. Thorinn dressed and buckled them on. "Are you ready to answer questions now?" "Not now, and not to you." "If you do not answer now, no more food or water will be given." With more boldness than he felt, Thornton answered, "You tried that once, and it didn't work. It won't work next time either. Leave me alone until I eat and rest." The voice said nothing more. Thornton examined his bundles, unwrapped some meat, ate and drank. He was weak, but growing stronger. "Now I'll answer questions," he said, "but only to the monitor, not you." Before he could blink, a man in a white robe was standing there. He was an old man, 3 ells tall, white of mane and beard. His yellow eyes burned into Thornton's. Around him was a lamplit glow. When he turned, spidery webworks of brilliance spun on the walls. Thornton would have fallen to his knees if he could. The breath went out of him, out of his body, and the fine hairs on his arms were standing up stiff as quills. "I am the monitor," the man boomed. "Will you answer my questions, Thornton Gordyatsson?" Thornton realized in panic that he had miscalculated. Before this awesome majesty, he felt himself no more than a worm. Yes, Lord," he said miserably. "Tell me then, where you went from the dark cave." There was a narrow passage. I get into it by moving stones away. Then another cave and another passage, and then I found a hole in the floor covered by a shield. Under that there was a cavern with people in it. Behind the monitor, one of the crystals in the wall came alight, and in it Thornton saw, as if spread out below him, the river and the forests of the flower people. "Was it this cavern?" the old man demanded. Yes." The crystal blinked, and now he saw a tiny shape floating down the river. It was the pleasure pod, and he realized with a cold shock that he himself was inside it. The pod ran down the swift current, sank under the wall of rock, and was gone. Now the picture changed again. Thornton was looking at the grassy bank above the river, where the dead limb still lay, and the forked limb on top of it, with the punctured gourd in the fork. The gourd he saw was beginning to rot. The crystal blinked again, and now he saw the whole device as he had made it. The gourd full of water holding down the fork of the limb, the creeper looped around the projecting stub at one end, tied to the pleasure pod at the other. "Is this what you did?" In the crystal, a tiny Thornton pierced the gourd with his sword, watched the water begin to gush out, then turned down the slope and got into the gaping pleasure pod. There was something wrong about the Thornton figure and the pod and the creeper. They had thin, pale edges that seemed to separate them from the rest of the scene, and the figure's movements were not quite right. The pod closed over the tiny Thornton. As the water continued to run from the gourd, the forked limb tilted, the creeper slid off the stub, the pod went down the bank into the river. Yes," said Thornton. That's what happened." "Who taught you to make such an engine?"
No one."
"How did you learn how to make it?"
I don't know. I just thought about it. And then there was a picture in my head of how it must be."
The monitor looked at him in silence for an instant. There was a pale edge around him, too, as if... "Where did you go from there?" the monitor asked in a different tone.
I was in the water. Then I went down where the stones were broken and found a passage going upward. And then I found a hole in the wall and went into a cavern."
"Was it this cavern?"
In the crystal, he saw a tiny Thornton sitting on the floor with treasures heaped around him. Here, that's odd," he heard his own voice say.
Yes," he said. The picture disappeared. "And where did you go from there?"
Through the roof into a great tunnel."
"Was it a tunnel like this?"
In the crystal, he saw the vast arcs of light running away into the distance. Yes."
"And from there?"
I fell into a shaft when a bird attacked me," he dared to add. "Was it your bird?"
"Yes."
In the crystal, Thornton saw himself toppling from the ledge. Gaping in horror, the image expanded, blurred, and he was looking down the shaft. watching his own receding body as it floated downward, dwindling to a point, gone.
And then?
The monitor demanded. I fell into a place at the side of the shaft.
Was it this place?
In the crystal, he saw the ribbed floor and ceiling, the 3 doors at the end. Yes, I went through one of those doors. In the crystal, he saw the bare platform.
And from there?
I went into a room. Yes, that one. He saw the broken metal, the burst ceiling.
And from there?
I found a passage that took me to another tunnel, and then a shaft into a cavern. From there, I went through a hole in the sky into a passage, and then a tunnel. And then your engine took me a prisoner. When I awoke up in another cavern, then I got out through the waterfall. And that's the end of section 1.